Welcome to the Philosophical Rambler podcast. Today we are going to be talking about free will and determinism. Thank you for listening to the podcast. This is our first episode, so we are very excited to get this podcast started, get it off the ground, and get it into the ears of people worldwide so that we can continue to spread our message of promoting philosophy in the 21st century. I am Collin Cooper speaking. I am the founder of Philosophical Rambler and the editor-in-chief.
And I am TJ Johnson, the executive editor for the UK.
And I am George Stanley, the associate editor of the Philosophical Rambler.
Glad to have you guys on today. Glad that we could all meet. And I guess, TJ, if you want to start us off, free will and determinism is right up your wheelhouse.
Yeah, well, free will versus determinism was always something that, it got me through my high school years. I read a lot about it, and then that got me into consciousness. But in the most recent articles by Philosophy Now, I got back into free will versus determinism, and that's why I've chosen it for today's topic. And I'm just hoping we can talk more about it.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think the free will versus determinism thing was something that I was quite obsessed with growing up. I'm 28 now, but when I was at college, we're talking 16 years old to 18 years old, I was quite obsessed with the idea. And for you guys who don't know, I recently wrote an essay on the Philosophical Rambler about this very, very topic, where I kind of went into some of the details. So I previously believed that we didn't have free will. And I was quite adamant about this when I was at college. And now, actually, I believe that we do have free will, at least in some sense of the word. Or I believe it's a thing that we see each other as having free will, and that's why we take responsibility. But I think this idea is very, what can I say, widespread these days. And I think it's very common now for people to sort of think, oh, well, there's no such thing as free will. And I think if you look at the people who believe this and sort of see how they go about their convictions and see how it affects their behavior, that in itself is something I've always found very interesting. And how, at least if you believe you have free will versus you don't, how does that affect your behavior? And how does that affect your very beliefs? I think you can tell a lot about someone by whether they believe or do not believe if you have free will.
Yeah, so you'd kind of say that some people believe that there's a ineffable plan, kind of.
Yeah, I think this concept of destiny it does definitely come into it. But it can get very abstract by sort of thinking, well, destiny is something avoidable, or do we have a certain greater self that we have almost waiting in our future to achieve? But then we also ask, is there different variations of destiny? A man who may be born of a great gift, for example, a creative man who could potentially become an amazing artist. How many people have untapped potential within them, creativity potentially, but out of means of necessity, they don't take the steps out of fear or whatnot, or potentially knowing rationally that it's highly unlikely they'll be able to achieve in certain things, in certain pursuits, where they'll go and just become a salesperson. Nothing wrong with that. They feed their family, they earn money, and they go about their thing. But they always knew they could have potentially lived a far greater destiny. So there's that way of looking at it. We're almost seeing we have a pull in us to become the best possible version of ourselves. But to be a destiny, does it always mean that you can choose to live out that destiny or not? That's a question I think is worth asking.
Yes, well, a lot of the time when I look at free will as just a philosophical problem, the people that see this deterministic route are the same people that use it as the basis to kind of cover up their faults.
Yes.
As in, oh, I couldn't do this, that's, just destiny, that's my route, if you know what I mean. Meanwhile, I think that I'm a person that believes in free will. I believe we're free to do anything we want. But that's where the concept of morality and common sense is key. Because I have free will to fly to New York right now. I could get in a taxi, go to the airport, get on a plane and fly to New York. I have free will and enough money to do that. But it would leave me without enough, for future plans. So therefore, it's not a wise choice to make, and that's where common sense comes into it.
Yes. If I can just interject there, I think this idea has been explored a lot through media and film and whatnot. And as a TV show I watched, there's a German TV show called Dark. I'm not sure either of you have seen it, but it's actually...
I've seen parts of it.
I highly recommend it. It's a very smart TV show. It's probably my favourite TV show, and it's quite a complicated TV show. It's written in a very German style. It's almost like an animation of an engine where there's so many working parts going with variable timelines, and it essentially at its core is exploring, do we have free will or not? And actually the end, moral to it is quite ambiguous, because most of it is led to us to sort of believe that whilst we may think we have free will, it's almost, we still have an innate drives underneath our surface. So whilst we have consciousness, right, so with a bit of us that can say, I'm going to wake up or not going to wake up, there's still the underlying drives to say, oh, well, I'm tired, I need more sleep. And, if you don't listen to that at all, you'll be very unhealthy, So there's always the animal in you, sort of. We are limited to our bodies to some extent. Like, I can choose to not drink water, for example, but that drive is going to become more and more strong the longer I go without drinking water. It will go so much that it will get to the stage that I have to drink water, otherwise I die. Now, how strong is willpower? Because will definitely exists. There's will. We all have will. But how free is that will? I think that will can be as free as we allow it to be. To allow us to be free, we have to make space within our own selves to make free decisions. Otherwise, we will be at the mercy of our instincts. If I neglect myself, if I do not drink water for a long period of time, I will be at the mercy of the instinct to drink water. I can strengthen up my consciousness through meditation. I can, monks practice this. They practice abstinence from sex. They practice fasting and whatnot. And these are all great practices to give us more control over our will. But it's always a balance between ego strength and unconsciousness, the drives underneath which are keeping us alive. So to be free is something that contains discipline. As Jocko Willink said, discipline equals freedom. The more time we take to garden ourselves, get our shit together, the more freedom we have, because we've made up more space and to actually do the things we can choose to do rather than be at the mercy of ourselves.
I definitely agree with you, George, on that point, because I think the physical limitation is a big aspect of what you're talking about. The physical limitation of us as human beings within our bodies. As many philosophers have said, we feel like we are often chained to this earth through our bodies. But I see the aspect of the spiritual side of things, of the spiritual side of free will, of God and free will is often the biggest argument that can be made under free will and determinism. Because if God exists, which I believe he does, then we have a whole nother element to the argument here. Obviously, if we follow the 20th century and 19th century philosophers, we can go more into the absurdism and nihilistic route. But if we follow free will pre-enlightenment or pre-medieval times, and we look at more along the lines of what the ancients believed about free will, then I think we can actually get to a better understanding. Because the ancients were much more in tune with the body and with Earth and the environment itself. Because, if you look at their daily life, it was far more involved with the environment around them.
Oh, yeah, the Druids especially.
Yes, compared to what we have today.
Yes,
where we sit in these, for lack of a better word, plastic boxes of cookie cutter homes that are spread out with very little room between them. And we wonder if we have free will or not. It's very hard to determine whether or not you have free will when your environment is stifling you.
It's almost... sorry to interrupt, Colin.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's almost as if there are certain powers that would rather we believe that we don't have free will. I think there's a lot of pressure to sort of convince us that we are helpless. And there's this underlying kind of tone of resentment running through our society that, oh, well, I'm underprivileged. I have these certain hands I've been dealt from a young age, and I have nothing I can do to escape this. So I hate life because I've been dealt this bad hand, and there's nothing I can do about it. I think that's almost a celebrated view in many circles, and it's almost encouraged. Misery loves company, right? Many people will look at the world and they have been dealt bad hands, and they say, well, this is just it. This is my life. There's nothing I can do about it. But the fact is, there's always something you can do about it. But to be able to do something about it requires a heightening of the consciousness. And I think the ancients knew that a connection with a higher power is the source of free will. The start of all wisdom is the fear of God, as it was said in the Old Testament. And I think there is something to said about the connection to something greater. It does give you more free will because you accept that you have limitations. The word to sin can literally be translated to mean to miss your target. If you sinned, you have missed your target on something. Most people don't see the word sin like that. They just say, oh, sinning is bad. But the fact is that we are human and divine both at the same time. We are part beast, part divine. We aren't entirely divine because we have limitations in our body. But we as humans have to realize that we are all sinners who have these limitations. And once we accept these limitations and carry those limitations, we can actually free up room to make more free will and make more free decisions. And I think having a time to yourself in reflection where you pray, or others may call it a form of meditation, does give you this connection to more energy, where you have a more playroom. You have more freedom to make decisions how you see best. You can sort of get your priorities in check. But the more you miss your target, you almost are limiting yourself by means of, oh well, I can't do this because of that. And that means you almost put yourself in a box. You trap yourself in your own prison. And it's almost like, we see this, a lot of people, they trap themselves in their own box. This is an archetype. I think I was talking to TJ before we started the podcast about this idea I wrote about in my first novel, The Tree of Life Mysteries, The Black Cube. This idea that you can trap yourself in a box where it's almost everything you know at one time is all you need to know. And then you close yourself off. So it becomes almost limiting. But you always need to understand that you can always let go of the old for new to grow. And that gives you the freedom to grow and to do things you didn't know you could do before. Making decisions that you might be scared of making. I think it is all connected. So it's definitely an area for, there's various ways to look at the free will versus determinism argument, but the spiritual side is definitely prevalent. And I think the more faith you have actually does give you more free will in a weird way.
Yeah, I completely agree on the fact of the more faith that you have gives you more free will, because right now I feel like, especially in the Western world, we are extremely constrained. It feels like there is a maze that has been set up, for lack of a better word, where we are boxed into certain paths, and based on the limited decisions we have within society, we are either going to rise or we're going to fall within society. But if you look historically, there was no box to be put in. There was no maze to be put in the first place. That's a modern construct. I mean, if you look even to the 20th century, people could aspire to do things that were beyond what the options were given to them in elementary or middle school, or even high school. People are told that they have to go into a limited number of careers, yet they don't think about, well, what are my options outside of those limited number of careers? It's like you're handed a platter of food at a buffet and you ask the chef to make something else. And they say, well, we don't make something else. We stopped doing that a long time ago. You can't just special order something.
Yeah.
Because something that people often talk about is, if you look at the Middle Ages, I mean, in the Middle Ages, if you were a strong, willful man who had a bit of means, you could go out and you could conquer like a small village, and then you could become lord of that village, and then you could expand your empire from that point on. I mean,
yeah, well, if I may interject,
yes,
my area of expertise is absurdism, and absurdism falls somewhat into that, as in Camus' book The Stranger, Mousseau kills a man on a beach purely to know what it felt like as an act of free will, But then he realizes in prison, that his actions, though on an ethereal level have no meaning, on this mortal world, you are bound by these laws, and if you do kill a person, you're going to be killed for that. Well, at least in France at the time, they killed people for killing other people, but it's that kind of your actions do have consequences whether you have free will or not.
Yes, I agree. And, another good example of this is in Crime and Punishment, isn't it, with Raskolnikov? And actually, I think Raskolnikov was one of the OG postmodernists in a way.
Yeah.
And postmodernism is almost the same ideology of the early forms of Marxism, or you could argue the early forms of nihilism. Nihilistic rationalism is probably the more fundamental way to sort of pin this down, because this kind of archetype will come and go in various forms. You can call it postmodernism, communism, Marxism. I'm sure in 100 years' time it will come in a new route. But at its roots, the spiritual side of it, the unconscious alignment with certain instincts or viewpoints is actually the same. It's just the way it surfaces and becomes ideologized in culture is going to be depending on the style of culture. It'll get wrapped up in something new. But what doesn't change is, whilst any archetype may change in its presentation, an Amazonian tribe may personify the hero archetype in their way, we in the West may personify in our way, the hero itself is still the same as an archetype. The image might not be the same in all dreams, but the fundamental roots and style of the image is still constant. And Raskolnikov, he believed himself he was above the values, and he's very smart. And the smarter the intellect is the more it thinks it can outwit the unconscious. And this is, once again, the worship of the ego is essentially a form of Satanism in its purest form. And if you look at Satan at least as a metaphor for the ego, it's I'm not saying it's necessarily always evil necessarily, but it has to be. You have to give the devil its due. And if you worship this, then it becomes bad. It's like he originally wasn't Satan. It was Lucifer. Lucifer was the highest angel in heaven, but he fell because he himself believed he would be worshipped as if he was God, when actually he is simply a tool in God's kingdom. But the problem is he believed that rather than the whole God being worshipped, he himself would be worshipped as if he was God. And this same kind of presentation we're seeing now is the ego is to be worshipped. And that essentially is sort of saying, well, I can do anything I want because I can calculate what's good and what's bad purely through my intellect. Raskolnikov believed he could steal from this pawnbroker because she wasn't a very nice woman. She basically came, I think it was her cousin or whatever, as a slave, essentially to help her do her work as a pawnbroker. And he said, well, what's wrong with me going in and stealing some trinkets? Because I need money, and with that money I can do a lot of good for the greater good. But what he didn't realise is
subjectivity, kind of.
Well, exactly. And the problem is he went there and it turned out very, very differently to how he thought it would turn out.
So imagine you go into a bank, you steal money, but that money came out of the accounts of people that were needing medical treatment. Is that still good?
Well, I suppose it's also
subjectivity.
Well, I suppose it's how you think you're always in control, but the claws of the unconscious will always poke their heads. Raskolnikov ended up killing the pawnbroker. He didn't actually expect to. And he also killed the other lady, who was quite innocent, because he did, in that moment, something which was unplanned. Your ego can only see so far into the future, but your greater wisdom part, your greater self, God, if you like, he knows best. And when you don't listen to that, you will worship almost a lower part of yourself, which is intellect. And intellect is great when it's integrated, but it is just a tool to be integrated. It's not the only way to live your life.
And if I may throw... Sorry, carry on.
No, it's fine. Please, go ahead.
If I may throw another question out there. If a believer in God says God knows best, God knows what's good for us, would that determine an ineffable godlike plan of determinism, or were humans created with free will? I know it's a bit of a, mouthful of a question to answer.
Well, I think this could be answered in the fact that whilst we can listen to the wisdoms of God, and depending on how you want to perceive this, you can see God as simply a psychological phenomenon, or you can see us as a beacon of which God speaks through. We have the choice through God giving us free will to listen and to act on what we've learned from ourselves and what we know inside ourselves, a moment of reflection, or we can choose to ignore it. And most of the time in our lives, we actually choose to ignore it. It's always the temptation to do the easy thing rather than the thing on our conscience. And it's far easier to ignore than to listen. And actually, the world we live in is always a conflict between these two forces.
Yeah.
So it's not like we are always godly. If God could, you could argue, oh well, why do all these bad things happen in the world? Why do people murder? If God is existing, why does he allow this stuff to happen? Because he's given us free will. Because this is actually what gives us meaning in our lives, is the ability to make mistakes. Because without mistakes, there would be no drama in life, and ultimately, drama is what gives our lives meaning and gives us purpose. Because if everything,
sorry.
No, I was saying if everything was purely good, then I can't even imagine it as a human, because only in some other heavenly realm can there be purely good. I think on Earth, we are still humans, and we are.
I have said, sorry if I may interject there, I've said in an essay that I've written before that you must have good with bad. A room of pure lightness without dark is blinding, and a room with dark and no light is an abyss. You can't have a coin with one side.
You can't. I agree.
If you had a world that was, as you say, purely good, if you set every action a person did on a scale from the best part of good to the worst part of good, there would still be something at the end, and that would be considered the new bad in this world, because the action of good/bad is subjective to what you're used to.
If I can just add, I would say that you could say it is subjective to some extent. However, I would say that I'm a follower of the belief that morality is still objective cross-culturally. Because
I'm saying, like, in a world of pure good,
I see what you're saying.
If you set every action a person did on a scale, the one at the end, though not being as bad as killing someone, in that world, it would be considered the new bad.
Yeah, because there's always got to be a scale, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine a world of pure good, because there'll be no differentiation, and that's the only way I can sort of perceive this heavenly realm, is because
how do you know what good is without knowing what bad is?
Well, that's the thing. You wouldn't, would you? And I suppose there wouldn't be any, and I suppose that's something which, we only have bad because there is good, and vice versa, because it's the tension between those two opposites that gives us any form of relationship.
Yeah,
and I think without that, then you wouldn't know any difference, would you?
No.
But that's exactly how it is on Earth. So unless good in some way is something of a more deeper nature, where good exists without a bad, purely because it is of something of a more spiritual origin, that is more of it's very hard to personify what pure goodness could be without having a reference to bad.
My idea of the worst part of good is giving £1 to charity when you've got a £5 in your pocket. That's kind of the worst type of good I can think of off the top of my head.
Well, I think I sort of perceive good as, rather than something materialistic and we can observe, because you could argue the same thing with about somebody who's doing a YouTube video and gives money to the homeless. So it's like, why are they really doing it? Are they doing it to give money, or are they doing it for clout, for
vanity,
views?
For vanity.
And I think ultimately this is why good can only, in my opinion, be perceived on something inside us. It's not a materialistic action. It is a spiritual alignment with a certain spirit. It is essentially alignment.
The world is the one we are born into.
And also, I think this is the whole thing of, like, if you're Christian, you believe aligning yourself with the conscience is good, and you may even do something that on the surface may look bad to most people, but it actually may be good in a way that only you and your relationship to God understood. And that's a bit of a weird thing to think about, but as long as, you may be in situations where at first everyone thinks, why did you do that? Why did you do that? But then 2 weeks later, everyone then suddenly understands that you knew you did the right thing because you did the right thing. An example being, for example, We look around at a lot of times in certain situations and ideologies, communism, where you could do something that was deemed bad by the ideology, but was still good because it was in alignment with your conscience. If for example,
when you were talking about the pure good world, just thinking about it, what came to mind was the Truman Show.
Yes.
This kind of utopian world which a man was born into. And they even say at the end of that, the world is the one we're born into. And a question I always think is, if you didn't know, would you still care? So as if he didn't know he was in this bubble, even if he died not knowing that he was in this show, would he still have cared about it?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the Truman Show, the whole show, he was always curious. And he did actually suspect things across that show, and that just shows you who humans actually are. Because he ultimately he was still at the burden of his instinct to be curious and to sort of see, well, what's outside all of this? And this is a very human way of seeing things.
Yeah.
If we were given this perfect utopian world, our first instinct would be to start smashing things, because we always want to go out with the old and move something new. Whenever we become stuck in a box, he was literally stuck in a box where everything he knew was all he needed to know. It's satanic. It's once again Satan. It's the same archetype once again, because everything Truman knew was all he was meant to know. But he wanted to be free of this and expand, and he wanted to see what was outside of this. And this is an innately human thing, that we will do things that are dangerous and not comfortable purely because, and this is what we risk ourselves, we'll do brave things purely for the means of expanding ourselves. And I think that's a very human thing. And to deny that is I think to deny us our humanity.
George, also, I think about scripture in the Bible, and I think don't let your other hand know what your other hand is doing when you give to the poor, when you do your alms. Because as you're talking about the conscious good versus the public vanity good, I mean, we see countless YouTubers and people today who do massive giveaways, or they're doing charity, but they all put it on video. Obviously, when you put it on video, the act becomes vanity then, almost. I mean, obviously, you're still doing a good act, but then the desire for fame is automatically questioned, because why are you uploading it on YouTube, or why are you putting that on social media when your one hand is not supposed to know what the other hand is doing? The purest act of good is when one person cares for another without anyone knowing.
And actually,
go ahead.
If I can interject, because I completely agree. And once again, if we view the situation as in value exchange, right? Money contains value, but so does spirit. We think that, oh, well, he's giving money to this homeless person to help him, right? But then if that homeless person finds out that he was given money because he was going on a recording, does that money then contain the same value? Because whilst another person could go and do something else, but he did it in a situation where he knew that that person was a lot more burdened, he still did it. And the very fact that that homeless person knew that that person didn't have to do it and maybe actually suffered because of that, that could be as a source of inspiration for that homeless person. And ultimately, that inspiration, that spirit, that understanding of a warm human being, that could actually be the thing to get him out of that homeless situation more than any amount of money ever could. So the exchange here is more of a spiritual level, and this actually is far more powerful than any earthly object could ever be. In Batman, was it the police chief? I can't remember. When Batman's parents got killed, put a jacket around that young boy's shoulder, and you could argue, oh, well, that's good because it makes him from not being too cold. But he was not going to die from being cold. But it was the fact that he knew that that person cared. And that understanding of knowing a person does actually care will actually transform his whole outlook at humanity, and knowing there's good people out there. And that in itself is a very powerful thing, far more powerful than the material act of putting a jacket on somebody's shoulders. It's actually the knowing that he did that and where that came from. That there has the power to transform. That is in the world of the spirit. And that is always going to be more powerful than any material act and that material consequence of value.
Yeah, and that's why you're able to reach out and help people regardless of, obviously, if their aim is they're going to spend the money on like cigarettes or alcohol or something of the sort, then obviously it's not as admirable to give to them if they were, say, buying bread or food or whatever it may be. But regardless, if you're unaware or if you're ignorant in the situation, you simply see a homeless man on the street and you give him money. I mean, the quote unquote reward for you is the same because you still have the same intention. You don't know where the money's going. I mean,
and this is why so I'll add one more thing. When I'm ever seeing a homeless person, I would much prefer. I would give them money if I could, but I'll be much more likely to talk to them because the value they could receive from a conversation, you're giving them potentially love, and that love is far more powerful than money. Money can come from love, and that's good. Of course, it can, but having a conversation has the potential to transform them as individuals, and there's nothing more powerful than that. It's if you generally would talk to someone with curiosity, ask them questions, tell them things that are coming from a good place, that there is far more powerful. And I think that's the core of it here is where it's coming from is what matters. It's the thought that counts beneath all those actions.
Well, I was going to say a minute ago, going on from movies, if you want to watch a really good episode of Futurama, there's one called Godfathers, where Bender is flying through space and he basically becomes God. And that is an amazing 20 minutes, and it's my favourite episode of Futurama, because it talks about our morality and whether the good thing is really the good thing and the consequences that come from that. If you help one person, another will falter, and then if you help them, the other. And at the end, Bender does meet, well, he says, I might be God, I might not. So we never really know. But he says, if you give them everything they want, they become dependent. And if you don't, they lose faith in you. So when you've done something truly right, no one will be sure you've done anything at all.
Yes, that's quite profound. And that almost comes and
it's
ties
a very,
into,
very good episode.
I think that's wise. And also it's almost like, well, why do we have natural disasters? It's like, well, if you were giving everything you want all the time, we become dependent. So sometimes gifts from God, this is why it's almost like the start of wisdom is to fear God. God has the potential to do things we may perceive as bad at first, horrific things. But we don't know that he has a greater plan for those things. And actually those things may have certain influence that ultimately,
the natural disaster,
the actual disaster could actually be the greatest good you could conceive. I know it sounds horrible to think about it like that. But to think about it,
others could knock all the buildings down, but in rebuilding it could boost tourism.
Well, yeah, among other things, right? Even if it could give them the act of reconstruction, could actually be the gift in some way, and in what they needed,
Yeah. So there's the good and the bad in everything, but it's that last quote that, as they put it, God says to him, which is again, when you do too much, they become dependent, and when you do too little, they lose faith.
Yes, it's true. It's quite wise, and it's funny how talking of media and films, the films and media I want to watch are ones that contain depth. So a lot of episodes of old school shows like The Simpsons and Futurama and things that are quite light on the surface can actually contain a lot of depth. And this is one thing that I think is becoming less and less common in modern media is depth, is relation to questions. Because all the best films I've ever seen, all the best content I've ever seen has actually been written by people who understand, or at least are curious people asking deep questions. That's what ultimately captivates an audience is, well, what does it have a moral? Is it exploring exploring something that is relevant to us as human beings? It seems today that there's so much focus on ideological, focus that is almost like, well, let's do this because this, or let's make an all-female cast because it's going to be good for the modern times, or let's just put these people in it because this is what we do now. It seems to be the whole story now is inverted. It's almost there to prove a point rather to explore a point. And as Jordan Peterson has said, that's great. That's the very definition of propaganda. The propaganda is you start with an answer and you create well, I say a piece of art, it's a piece of content to prove why you're right. Whilst art is you have a question and you're using that to help explore that. And that is what actually creates and inspires, is you don't know the answers, but you're exploring it through the writing and the conversations with the characters. That's actually what has these great moments of creativity and revelation.
As I said just before we came on this podcast, I said it's good because philosophy, whether you like it or not, is a social thing. If you only believe your own philosophies and stay in your bubble, as you've put it, that's narcissism and that's an ego.
Yes.
But philosophy, to become a good philosopher, you have to listen to others, gain ideas from them, look at the world from a different perspective, kind of stand on your desk.
Yeah, I think philosopher and being a spiritual person are actually synonymous. I think philosopher and being like a monk, for example, or a Buddhist monk or a priest, they are essentially all just philosophers, because the whole aspect of allowing you to die and rebirth yourself, I think, is the key relation that good philosophers and spiritual people have, is because they have accepted the way of the crucifixion. And I think the whole, the very orthodox way of looking at Christ is almost embodying, you carry that cross up the hill, you suffer, you allow yourself to die and to be reborn. And that is exactly what Christ did. He died and he was resurrected. And that there is such a deep metaphor for what actually we should aim to do as human beings. We bear our sins on a cross, we let them die with us. So we have something we believe, we challenge ourselves, we listen, we pay attention, we hold our tension on this cross between two opposite sides, we bear that tension and we accept it. And then when we allow that part of us to die like a tree's dead wood, it will then grow back as fresh, new life. And this is something we must live by, is this embodiment of the phoenix. It's almost, this is what Jung talks about with the self. It's allowing us to constantly integrate elements from the ego, to let go of that, and then to reintegrate new elements and continuously allow this process of death and rebirth to happen. And that's, he calls this individuation, is to become more of a deep individual, is to allow the cycle of integration and assimilation constantly to happen. And this is actually how we grow as individuals, is to bear our old parts of what we thought we were. When we were wrong, we accept that. We allow new information to come in. We suffer the cognitive dissonance that comes with that. And then this process is almost like it can be viewed in the same sense of an alchemical approach, just like the reaction of substances, returning lead into gold. And this is the whole, Jung talks about the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. That is what turns lead into gold. And that is the very element of essentially the Christ. It's the element that we embody, we focus on, is our target, it's our cross. And that there is the very element that we align ourselves with. It's the highest value, is to bear the tension of these reactions. Reactions are painful. You look at a reaction in chemistry, flames spark, a visceral reaction, it's painful, but we end up becoming greater. Eventually this diamond is essentially a coal, but in a more condensed form. Coal just has to go through a lot of condensing over a long period of time, shedding it off, getting condensed. And this is how it becomes so pretty and beautiful, is through this process of refinement. And that can only come through pain and bearing your cross in life.
So it's that thing again of you can't have the good without the bad.
No, and this is exactly it. And this is exactly why it's almost, the hero archetype of going out into the dark, into the dragon's lair, and facing your fears and suffering because of it. And it'll be very scary. But then once you've conquered that, there's new life waiting for you in the form of a virgin or gold. And then you bring that back to your kingdom. You bring that back to the left hemisphere of your brain, the known world. And that becomes a new part of you. And then guess what? Once you've then built your kingdom, it's a bit stronger. Your known world is a bit stronger. You're a little bit wiser. Then you can go out again. Then that son becomes the king, becomes the father. And he gives birth with the virgin to a new son. And that son does the same thing. And this is relating to, firstly, the individual, but also as cultures. And if we as a culture inhibit individuals from embodying this process, we trap ourselves in a box, in a black cube, a cube of ungrowth, of stagnation. And what I find so funny is how this archetype of the box is in alchemy seen as Saturn, the sixth planet from the sun. Saturn is personified as heavy, as dragging you down, in the sense that it's stagnation. And if you look on top of Saturn, what is there? There's a hexagon cloud. How crazy is that? A hexagon is essentially a cube. It's, if you look at a cube and a hexagon, a three-dimensional cube is a hexagon, right? So it's almost
if you get the shadow of,
you see what I'm saying? If you draw the lines across, you see what I'm saying? So if you represent a three-dimensional cube, it will be a hexagon because of the lines. You see what I'm trying to say there? So, you know, I just find that fascinating how this archetype is not new at all. And I feel like this is essentially, and it's almost funny how we look at scripture and Revelation, and we sort of see this kind of this between the 6 and the 7 are very deep numerical kind of symbols here. We see 666, number of the beast. 6, the world was created in 6 days in Genesis 2:2, and on the 7th day God rested, right? Because 6 is the days of work. 6 is a working number. It's the first perfect number. 1 + 2 + 3 is 6. But the 7th day, the Sabbath, is the day where we look at what we have created, we reflect on it, see how it could be better, and then we do it again. Okay, so this is the differentiation between the 6, the beast system, where everything is stagnated. It's Saturn. It's stopped. It's led.
But meanwhile, the Lord's Day on Sunday is the time for rebirth, rethought,
exactly. Yes. And that's just why we always see 7 as associated with an angels and good and whatnot. Lucky number 7. It's in our culture. It's a meme.
See, I'm not a religious man myself, but no matter what, well, I went to church when I was younger with my mum, all the way up until I was about 11 or 12. But no matter what, though I'm not religious now, I do not work Sundays. I have Sundays off. I don't do any work. I barely leave the house on a Sunday. And I read, I rethink of my week, think of what I'm doing the next week. And it is a time for my own personal relaxation, meditation, and to watch Call the Midwife.
And you know, wouldn't surprise me if there is some sort of kind of psychic connection to the 7th day of the week. And it kind of, even if you look at the cycles of us as humans, our collective unconsciousness, you look at the cycle of planets, you look at the natural order of things, there seems to be a natural popping
7 planets.
Yeah, of course, it seems to be there's a natural cycle of things, there's natural patterns we see, and it seems to be that 7 is always associated with the same style. So this is why I believe in objective reality, is because once you understand the way broadly, you will see it in all things, in everything, as a famous samurai once said. So I think this is why I think having a relationship with bedrock reality, once you sort of understand symbolism, you see how these symbols transcend.
And I've just counted on my finger, sorry if I may interject while I've got it in my mind, I've just counted on my fingers, there's 7 colours in the rainbow, isn't there?
Absolutely, this is exactly what I write about.
The rainbow was created by God after the flood.
Absolutely. So and also, so this is an extremely interesting topic. This is what I write about. Yes. So in my book, 7 colors of the rainbow. What's the 7th color? Violet. Look at Buddhism. Look at Hinduism. How many chakras are there? 7. Right. What's the 6th chakra? The third eye. What's the 7th? The crown. Right. So the 6th is the highest. Right. But it's still nothing without the integration of the 5 others.
While I say the crown, do you mean that is like a royal crown or the crown of the head?
So it goes above the head, right? So basically, in Hinduism, Buddhism,
do you mean like a material crown?
It's more of a spiritual crown,
rather than the crown of the head.
So it radiates above your head. Essentially, the point is it symbolizes the integration of everything into a wholeness. It's the highest vibration. Okay, they see it as it basically represents all of the chakras working together in harmony. Okay, it's the 6 needs the 7 to be whole. If the 6 worships himself, he falls from heaven. It's Lucifer, right? Doesn't mean the 6 is bad. It just means if he falls in love with himself as the most powerful operating system, then he will block the flow of current through the spine, through the kundalini, as they say.
Yes.
So it's always, and all religions, you see the same kind of archetypes in different ways, you know. So it's a very profound way to see it. And in my book, I had Excalibur, which was given to Arthur through Saint Michael, and when he was channeling when he was challenging his self from the correct place, it was given to Michael as a self-defense, as a mechanism of it will spin, so it spins inside the hilt of the sword, all the 6 colors up to indigo, but then when he's channeling the spirit of God, it spins, and it spins fast, and it radiates violet, and that is when the sword becomes usable in battle, because it means that Satan can never use it, because it's only when you're at one with God that you can actually use the sword in its true power. And this is a metaphor for what we are, is when we are truly at one with ourselves and we're using all of ourselves together, not focusing on one part, but all of us. That is when we are most at one with God, because we're using all of God's tools we've given us, but we're using them together in harmony, and we're not worshipping one more than the other. And this is, I think, why a lot of Christians, they look very poorly upon multiple deities, and they call it paganism, right? They say there's one God, because if you sort of break down into lots of gods, you can relate more with one specific God, like the God of war. Oh, I love war. But if you over-identify, war has a place, but if you over-identify with one instinct, you almost become in love with one part of yourself, but neglect the others in your pantheon. And it's almost these sub-personalities within us, which you can see, you can see them in a chakra way, you can see them in a like a pantheon, like they're gods, they have their own personalities. If you relate with one of them more, but you don't allow the others to sort of be integrated, you are a fragmented individual. And this is why it's wholeness. He talks about wholeness is the point of life. It's holding all of them together and allowing them to react with each other. And I think this is the point we want, is like being yourself in a sense. It's almost to be at one with this totality. And it's very easy now to sort of worship one thing as like a false lower idol, when actually you want to worship the totality of your being, and not to neglect any part of you, because you've got it for a reason. And if you don't integrate it, it's going to be pushed down into your shadow, and it's going to be rejected and project through your very self. And I think this is exactly what's happening now, is toxic masculinity. It's like, yes, any archetype has a shadow side to it, but if you completely demonize it, guess what you do? It turns into a demon. And then it's in the shadow, and that's where it's going to cause harm.
I think that is a good place to wrap it up, probably. We've been going on for a good while here.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Right. Well, pleasure.
All right. It was great talking to you guys, opening up the first episode of the podcast for the first time. And obviously there will be many more sessions to come.
Pleasure. Well, thank you very much, guys. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm really looking forward to sort of have more of these conversations. This is the next step. Yeah,
definitely.
This is the birth of the new generation of Philosophical Rambler, and it's a privilege to talk to you, boys.
And hopefully we've inspired a few people to pick up a new philosophy book and start reading.
Good luck with that. Get them get them off TikTok first. That's the first step.
Yeah, new year, we've got to get reading again.
Yep. Gotta get those reading lists going. All right, guys. Great having you on. See you soon, and stay tuned for all the podcasts coming up.
See you later. Bye.
See ya.